Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
We only have X number of roads out of town, and they start cutting them. We're not joking.
We sent water and food. I miss Snickers bars, so those would be great.
Yeah.
I'll send an airdrop in for you, Nathan.
Oh my god.
And rum for Jeb.
Yes,
Jeb
that
needs
might
rum.
work.
Jeb needs more rum.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, the Archaeology Podcast Network is starting a new 3-tier membership system in July. All your favorite shows will always be free, but we're offering a little extra for those that want it. Check out arcpodnet.com/members for details. That's arcpodnet.com/members for details on our awesome new member site. Thanks for supporting us.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 76. I'm your host, Sarah Head, and I'm joined today with my co-hosts, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. Today we have special guest, Nathan French, with us, from the University of Miami in Ohio. Nathan works in the Department of Comparative Religions and is an expert in Islamic law and the histories and theories of jihad and Islam. Nathan joins us today to talk about the destruction of several archaeological sites of importance as well as artifacts throughout the Middle East that have either been destroyed or have been sold on the black market, and how that impacts the field of archaeology. Get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah Head, and I am joined today with my co-hosts, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. How's it going, guys?
It's going swell. Raining like hell here in Connecticut, but I'm looking forward to this podcast.
Ken, before we start, are you digging this summer? I had the feeling you were.
Yeah, I will be in the field beginning next week, right after Memorial Day. So
okay, all right.
Maybe I'll drive up to Connecticut and stick a trowel in the ground with you.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And today we have a special guest with us is Nathan French, who is out of the same institution as Jeb.
Yes, Nathan. Yeah, good morning, Nathan. You are a assistant professor in our Department of Comparative Religion, and you're not an archaeologist. I want to put that straight out there, and
Absolutely
that's fine.
not.
You're not the first person we've had on the show that's not, but you actually bring some really detailed knowledge about a topic that there's been a lot in the news. There's been a lot of interest, and frankly, while you might think, wait, this doesn't fit archaeological fantasies, it absolutely does on multiple levels. And what we've asked you to come in and talk about, you're a specialist, and I don't want to misrepresent, but basically a specialist in studying jihadis and jihadism, right?
That's right. All right. So my sort of research background is in contemporary jihadi Salafism. So that means I'm studying Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and their relative affiliates and offshoots and developments. Once had a student write an entire paper on jihadi salamis, which was unfortunate. But so I study jihadi Salafism.
Salafi.
I do enjoy a good salami, but this is not that subject.
Yeah,
I was wondering if that was just like one of those words that's like sounds the same but was spelled different kind of thing.
I think it was autocorrect for the win or for the fail. I'm not sure which way to take that.
That sucks when that's your paper, though.
If I ever decide to open a Middle Eastern delicatessen in Manhattan, that's what it's going to be called. Jihadi salamis.
And it'll last for like a week.
Yeah. But we wanted to bring you on because one of the things, I mean, Islamic State is unfortunately infamous for any number of things. And this is your work is you study what they're up to. You're right. Publishing. We'll talk about it again, but you have some publication things in the pipe. Are you in a place you can talk about some of that?
A little bit. So right now I'm actually finishing up a manuscript called "And God Knows the Martyrs," which looks at both how Jihadi Salafis create sort of jurisprudence, what we'd call in Arabic fiqh, and their interpretation of the Sharia, and how within that creation they develop an idea of martyrdom that's very much ascetical, which is something that isn't often studied in Islamic studies. So it's one of the sort of the first looks at sort of the praxis of Jihadi Salafism that tries to go beyond just the raw violence that you encounter, in the day-to-day of the headlines.
Right. And that's why I wanted to bring you in, because one of the things, in addition to all the other horrible things that Islamic State is infamous for, is they have made quite a showing, quite a practice of blowing the hell out of archaeological sites, grinding down archaeological monuments, primarily in northern Iraq, but in just that general whole borders are a mess area of Southwest Asia. And our immediate, and I talk to students about this, I talk to colleagues, and of course our immediate thing is, oh my God, this is horrible. It is. But one of the reasons I have you come and talk to my class, Culture, Art, and Artifact, about this, and I wanted to have you on the show about this, is it's not anywhere near as simple and straightforward as these people are non-modern barbarians and they do this for, given that you're looking at praxis, given you're looking at jurisprudence and sort of some of the philosophy behind these actions, I wanted to bring you on to talk about some of that and maybe help us understand why the hell this is happening, why archaeological sites are being targeted. And let me just start with this. I think a lot of people, and I probably would have started here a couple of years ago, who would go, I have, who have no real idea about this, would go, images are forbidden, and these are really super religious people, therefore that's why this is happening. What are all the different things wrong with what I just said?
So I think it's a good launching off point to start the conversation on just what this idea of Jihadi Salafism is. And it's a term that Jihadi Salafis themselves have actually adopted. And a few different scholars and journalists, among them Thomas Hegghammer from Norway, have sort of traced the genealogy of the origin of the term and actually argue that this may have been an actual Western neologism that the jihadis themselves adopted and liked it so much they kept it. So Jihadi Salafism, it's better to start with the Salafism part to work into the jihadism part. Salafism has a whole lot of different expressions in the global Muslim community. 1.6 billion Muslims, all sorts of different interpretations and understandings of what Islam is. For Salafis, they believe that the most authentic expression of Islam is to follow the example that was set by the Prophet Muhammad, who of course died in 632 of the Common Era, and his companions and followers. So let's say roughly the first 3 generations following his death. And the belief there was that because those generations could transmit, either witnessed or could transmit often verbally, later in writing, the precedent of Muhammad, they had the best understanding of what it was to live the prophetic precedent of Islam. And we should be very clear that Salafis themselves are not innately violent. The vast majority of Salafis live very quiet lives, if in some ways they might understand their life as being somewhat withdrawn and varying places from sort of quote-unquote mainstream society in order to better protect the sort of the purification and the quality of their life of faith. I always use the example for my students. When you travel to the Near and Middle East and elsewhere, you'll see what's called a siwak stick in the grocery store, often next to a toothbrush. And the siwak stick has antimicrobial tendencies, we've later found out, but it was used by Muhammad to clean his teeth. And so one of Muhammad's cultural practices, one of his precedents, one of what we call his sunnah, was to brush his teeth daily with the siwak stick, and he lauded those who did so. And so in the modern context, if someone's reading the sunnah and is trying to follow the prophetic example, many Muslims would read that and go, well, we may not have to use a siwak stick now. God sent down other revelations, and Muhammad had other sayings that said, that, and roughly speaking, science, rationality, these are good things, and we now have toothbrushes and toothpaste, and so we should use those. But following the prophetic model, we should clean our teeth every day. A Salafi, on the other hand, might go, well, those are modern inventions. We should follow the prophetic example as best we can, and therefore I'm going to use a siwak stick.
This is getting back to the fundamentals.
Yeah, exactly. Going back to the source. For jihadis, where we get jihadi Salafism, is the idea that source is very, very important. But it is so important that it's actually under threat. It's existing in a state of emergency. And so for jihadis, there is an obligation, an individual obligation to struggle in God's cause, to sort of struggle to wage a jihad, to restore or protect that precedent. And at the core of that precedent for the Salaf, for jihadi Salafis, is the importance of God's monotheism, or what we call in Arabic tawheed, the idea of protecting God's oneness, which also means removing any partners to God. Now, those partners to God might be what we think of as sort of the cult of polytheistic deities from before the revelation of Islam. But in the modern period, for jihadi Salafis, that could include something like capitalism, in which one's God becomes wealth and its acquisition, or democracy, in which case the sovereignty of the people replaces the sovereignty of God, the head of the state. So
any kind of potentially competing ideologies that take away from this oneness.
Exactly. Yeah. And to sort of show one's adherence to that oneness of God, there's a difference between sort of one's creed, one's aqidah, and one's implementation of that creed, or one's methodology, one's manhaj. And so that sort of starts us on the path to talking about what's been happening in Syria and Iraq over the last few years with these various sites. Because in part it is a way of expressing the usage of these sites for the self-proclaimed Islamic State of Iraq and Hashem. The usage of these sites is a way of performing multiple different roles. Some of those roles are for Western audiences, and some of those roles are also for local audiences, or for those Muslims whom they feel they can recruit, and non-Muslims as well.
You've been in your class, and I actually don't know. We might talk about this if we will link to some of this and Sarah. But you've shown in my class, for example, some of the videos or parts of them, where they're destroying bits of this Assyrian site and that Babylonian site, where a winged horse is being a bull-headed horse is being destroyed, or a man-headed bull is being destroyed. All of this, and right. You mentioned multiple performances. Those videos, those are aimed partly at the West, but a lot of those, like you said, are very much recruitment. One thing that I find absolutely fascinating. So first of all, if I was going to summarize what you just were talking about, there's this interest in fundamentals, this fundamentalism, but it's only a subset that is frankly paranoid about it being sort of attacked from the outside, or attacked from within, or just from some quarter. Is that sort of a fair way of putting it?
I think it's a fair way of putting it, yeah.
So you've got, because the thing is, this frankly sounds like some of the things we've talked about on the show in terms of other kinds of religious fundamentalism and religious politics. But those videos seem to be largely aimed at recruitment. And one of the things I found absolutely fascinating is, again, I think there's very much this misconception that a lot of this is coming from heavy ideology and people who are big students of ideology. And that's a lot of people in Islamic State aren't. That does not well describe them, does it?
Not everyone in ISIS is particularly well versed in the intricacies of the theological and legal texts that a lot of the ISIS leadership is working with. But that being said, we know from their discussions of training that they are receiving compulsory religious classes every day at some level. So again, I think we can say that these videos and these materials, in terms of various audiences, are a way of showing to adherents, to potential recruits, and to others that they're following through in action on the basis of the ideas that they're putting out in texts and in tweets and elsewhere.
Right. So this is definitely performance. So taking a grinder to an ancient monument, or blowing up the arch at Palmyra. So part of that is definitely a performance to show, like, look, we are doing the things that go back to fundamentals. Like, we are removing these ideologies. And there's one example that I know we've talked about in the past, and that is, I'm pulling up my notes, Dr. Al-Assad, Khaled Al-Assad. He was a Syrian archaeologist, and he was one of the guardians of Palmyra. and he ended up being killed, beheaded, and then blown up when Palmyra, the arch there, which was a Roman period site, and we're going to come back to that, was destroyed. And I think maybe you were talking about, again, separating ideologies. How might he be viewed from this perspective?
Well, I think we have to look at the timeline of how these videos sort of unfolded.
Go ahead.
So, so ISIS sweeps into Mosul in June of 2014. By February of 2015, they're releasing videos like the ones we've talked about in class of the Lamassu being ground down and jackhammered and various panels being destroyed. Of course, some of those look to have been authentic. Some of those look to have been perhaps or originals. Some of those look to have been replications.
Some appear to be plaster replicas. Yes, not all, but some do. Yeah,
that's right. Shortly thereafter, in April, ISIS really goes all in on the Assyrian city of Nimrud. And what's interesting there is one of the temples they destroy, we should probably mention this now, I guess. One of the temples they destroy is that of Alat, who was understood to have been a goddess worshipped along with Manat and Al-Uzza in Mecca in the pre-Islamic period. So we see within, almost a year of taking control of Mosul and that area of Iraq, once they have firm control, they begin sort of reasserting a historical narrative on the territory. And part of that, what's interesting about that is, of course, when the Prophet Muhammad makes the return into Mecca, 628, 629 of a common era, one of the first things he does is destroy these other polytheistic deities in Mecca. So in many ways they're actually reperforming in their understanding. They're reperforming the actions of the prophet. They return to their home territory, having been exiled from northern Iraq, having to go into Syria. They come back to northern Iraq, and they begin destroying these polytheistic deities, including the shrine to Allah, this possible female consort of Allah, as understood in the pre-Islamic period. So they see themselves from the very beginning as sort of asserting a narrative of, we are following the prophetic precedent in establishing a state in this territory. And then a few months later in July is when we get the very visceral and violent public execution video staged in the Palmyra amphitheater, in which the entirety of the entire male population of the neighboring communities is brought in to watch the execution of those whom ISIS proclaim are spies against the state. By August of 2015, we get a video of the destruction of another shrine. And then, of course, in May of 2016, we'll probably get there a little later, once the Russians have taken it back over, they host a concert. So we see this set of competing narratives.
It's an
right?
empathy.
The February toppling of the statues, yes, they do acknowledge in their publication, Dabit is meant to antagonize the West. And antagonize what they know is a Western concern for cultural history. It's also meant to perform.
I want to come back to that.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. It's also meant to perform, a way of antagonizing the West in the sense that why is it? I mean, in a lot of ways, ISIS is similar to Al Qaeda on this account. It's about hypocrisy. So the question there is, why is it you Westerners are so concerned with cultural heritage, cultural legacy, and these stones, these dead stones of these dead civilizations? Why is it you care so much about them, but you don't care about the lives of innocent Muslims that are being taken away by the regime in Syria and by what they would consider to be interfering, meddling, imperialist, and disbelieving powers? Right? Why is it you care so little for human life and so much for this monumental law?
That's interesting because it reminds me of when the Taliban blew up the Buddhas in Afghanistan in 2001. One of the buzz was that, listen, we want to prevent you Westerners from putting all this money into saving statues, and you don't care about the famine that's killing people right in the shadows of those statues. So they were making sort of that same argument that you guys are more interested in dead stone than you are in living people. And we are going to punish you for that, or we're going to antagonize you as a result of your focus on dead stuff and you're ignoring living people.
Yeah. Right. Certainly an antagonism, but it's also, think about it this way. Some of this, again, it goes back to multiple layers of purpose. It goes back to recruitment, right? The goal is to show these individuals in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan that the nation state cannot meet their needs and fundamentally does not care about them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's funny you bring up the Taliban and the Bamiyan Buddhists in 2001, Ken, because I actually in class, and this angered some students, and I was making it as a point,
Right.
went the other way with that, because the Taliban was executing people because their hair wasn't right, and they were killing women like by dropping walls on them with tanks and other kinds of things. And this was in the news, and people were paying attention. But when the Buddhas got blown up, holy shit, all the news.
Right, yeah.
All the news media. And I have some thoughts that I would like to come back to later in the show about why that is. But, you know, people were like, oh, well, yeah, they're killing these people, but oh my God, they blew up those statues. There's an argument sometimes from the other side there as well. And this will get back to, I think, some motivations. You mentioned the videos, Nathan. And one of the things I want to point out is, again, the ones that are made especially for you know, consumption. Some of my students, when they saw bits of these, they very much commented on them being really slick. And this is another one of these kinds of, I think, misconceptions. And some of my students were like, wait, why are they using really good, aren't they anti-modern? They're using really good software and blah, blah, blah. Could you clear that up a little?
Well, I'd say one of the sort of older discussions in Salafi thought, well, I say older, one of the early 19th century, 20th century conversations, especially early 20th century conversations in Salafism, was on the usage of loudspeakers to broadcast the call to prayer, or even the usage of cassette tapes to disseminate the Friday sermons, the khutbahs, and other lectures Salafi scholars might give. And in that sense, there's an idea of public welfare. Like, what is best for the public welfare? If one is using technology as the vehicle to spread the truth, as in this case, as jihadi Salafis understand it, of what Islam is, then there can be no harm in using the technology that is provided to be able to do so. Just as paper was once a new technology in the Abbasid Caliphate, so too now are these electronic devices a way and means of disseminating and sort of missionizing the populace as to the truth of what these communities understand Islam to be. So in honesty, there's no issue with the technology. In fact, most recently, the ISIS has been touting these new anti-tank rockets that it's developed on its own, ostensibly, it says, in Syria. So they have no problems with technological development. The problem becomes when the technology enters into the level of God. So let's say, for example, I don't think they'd be terribly fond of the idea of transhumanism or genetically modifying or technologically modifying the body.
Right. Well, and this is the thing. This is one of the several reasons, and we'll get to some more, why I think this actually is, in addition to our just larger archaeological mission, appropriate for the show that we do, because something we've railed on quite a bit is that a lot of stuff that we cover, and whether, a lot of it seems very goofy and some of it's less goofy, we've had some other more serious topics on, a lot of it is anti-modern. A lot of it is not, we want to go back to the past. It's, there are things about modernity that we don't like. And that's kind of what I'm hearing here, is going back to the fundamentals because of these other ideologies that have arisen and threatened what we should already be doing. And I find actually some really interesting parallels there. You were mentioning a timeline, Nathan. Where are we right now? Because I want to get into a second topic for our not a second topic, but a second part of this topic for our second section. But where are we in terms of timeline, in terms of, are these things still going on? You mentioned that the Russians retook Palmyra. What's kind of going on with have there been recent destructions of heritage sites, and in terms of sort of the general situation in the area that Islamic State controls?
Well, we've seen if the Pentagon reports are to be believed, but also news reports and first-hand observers, we've certainly seen a significant reduction in the territory controlled by ISIS. So the percentages there vary, not terribly widely, but they do vary. Certainly, the Islamic State has been being pushed out of Mosul bit by bit. An offensive that the Iraqi national forces hoped would only last a few weeks has instead, taken a considerable number of months. It's been a very difficult fight, but
this
largely,
began in October, right? Something like that.
That's right. Yeah, and they've largely pushed those forces back and out. The territory in Syria has also been degraded, and ISIS has been pushed back there as well. So the levels of and I think just to start using the language now in segments ahead, the levels of trafficking and also looting, I think, have started to dwindle. But the most recent reports have been harder to come across. The most recent reports have been harder to come across because, again, we're dealing with a situation where that territory is increasingly under fog of war. So that's been a lot harder to get a sense of. I also think in many ways the sensationalism surrounding that industry has declined. So we see fewer State Department discussions. And another reason we may be seeing fewer State Department discussions is they're still very much undergoing a leadership transition after the election.
There's a little less State Department than there used to be right now.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And also we're seeing, I think the news media is turning its attention elsewhere as well.
Possibly to glowing orbs of some kind. Yeah, but yeah. So why don't we? That kind of brings us up to present. Why don't we take our break? And when we come back, what I think we really should talk about, because you've mentioned several times reactions to the West, trying to provoke the West. I think that's a thing that we really need to talk about. And sort of, I think, set up, and you also mentioned the State Department, mentioned sort of the attention on this. I think we kind of need to set up a larger historical backdrop of archaeology, politics, empire, and this whole concept of civilization.
Great.
Okay, so let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, we will rejoin the conversation.
Interested in archaeology? Want to hear from experts in the field about the latest discoveries and interpretations? Check out the Archaeology Show every other Saturday and let hosts Chris Webster and April Camp Whitaker take you deeper into the story. Check out the Archaeology Show at www.archpodnet.com/archaeology and subscribe, rate, and comment on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and the Google Music Store. That's www.archpodnet.com/archaeology. Now back to the show.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals. That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Hey everyone, and we are back, and we are still talking with Nathan French. Jeb, what did you want to jump in on in the next part of this?
All right. Well, so Nathan has given us a good thumbnail sketch of Salafism and jihadism and how this ties into the Islamic State and how this impacts, because one of the things they've made themselves infamous for is destroying archaeological resources. And we kind of hinted several times in our first segment at antagonizing the West, entangling the West. Why does the West care about dead stones? And frankly, I think we could take this much farther back, but I think a really good starting place chronologically is, and I have to remember, I think it's 1798, Napoleon invades Egypt. Napoleon invades Egypt to cut the British Empire in half, to cut off his foes of the British Empire from India, but he also brings a lot of scholars with him. And because there had been a long history of the Middle East, and especially Egypt at that time, but then increasingly the area we're talking about, being the cradle of civilization, the heart of civilization, the place of Abraham, the place of Moses, the place of Jesus, the Holy Land. And there were not archaeologists. There were people that did things that are vaguely like archaeology. There were not actual archaeologists at that time. But Napoleon brings a bunch of scholars with him. They do lots of work, some of which is still quite important, and most famously, soldiers find the Rosetta Stone, and it becomes a war trophy. The French take it, then the British beat the crap out of the French, and they take it, and it's a British museum, et cetera, et cetera. This kicks off a rush for imperial archaeology, for basically imperial agents, or for the glory of nation states and empires that are being built in Europe in the 19th century, a rush of going and getting archaeological things. And this is also true of the classic world, it's true of other places, but the Middle East is definitely one of these places. And Nathan, you again mentioned repeatedly dead stones and all of that. There's a narrative that I think is actually really important for understanding this. If you start to look at travelers, it was at one time, was it the Grand Tour? Is that what it was called? What the European, like, you know, if you were coming of age, you would do. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, yes, which is
the Grand.
Also now the popular name of a not BBC Top Gear show.
Oh, really? Oh, wow!
It's now called the Grand Tour.
But yeah, and so basically, at that time, young men. Now it's sort of the backpacking through Europe for Americans. But you would go and see the sites of civilization. You would go to Egypt. You would go, if possible, to the areas that are now Iraq and Turkey, depending on the politics of the time. You go to Greece, and you would see and sort of get your worldly education before you came back and became an accountant for, you know, Jacob Marley or something back in London. And this was part of that. And you see these images emerging, these paintings, and then these etchings, and then these photographs as the 19th century and technology progress of these ancient sites. And some of them are very cool. Some of them are in 3D. You know, you wear the stereoscopic glasses and do that. And a lot of them have a very similar narrative of local people, often in the picture for scale. And there's often a narrative, either spoken or unspoken, that these people have nothing to do with these ruins. That the modern people of Egypt are standing in front of the Sphinx, but they're not really. And to some degree, this ties into like our ancient alien stuff and our hyperdiffusion stuff. These aren't really the people that built it. These are just the sort of modern savages that live there. You know, it's like, well, these people are Greek, but they're not. You know, they're not the Greeks. Or you know, we may. Ken.
I'm just saying this is replicated with the mound builder myth here in the United States.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, now, in some cases, it's not as literal as the mound builder myth. It's like, well, yes, these are their descendants, but look how much they've fallen. You know, I mean, raise your hand, and of course, this is an audio media, so this works beautifully. You know, but raise your hand if you've ever seen any television, movie, play, etc., about the Romans, where anybody had an Italian accent of any kind.
Right, yes.
Where they didn't sound like Sir Laurence Olivier. No, I mean, to us, the Romans are upper class British people. You know, that's a reality. And this plays into this area. So this kind of, when we're talking about who cares about these dead stones start to get created as the building blocks of civilization, which is why all of these Europeans and later Americans, but primarily Europeans, were going and grabbing them and sticking them in national museums and national capitals to show, hey, look, we got pieces of civilization. Look, I got the Elgin marbles right here. That means I'm super civilized. I totally chiseled them from somewhere else. It means I'm super civilized. And you know, you mentioned Nimrud and all the cool artifacts there. I was astounded when I went and saw all those things of Nimrud in the Bloomsbury district of London in the British Museum. I mean, they're beautiful, and they're not in Nimrud, which of course we'll get back to. What? Yes, Sarah.
I'm gonna do something real quick. So you guys are saying Nimrud, and I understand that you also mean the word that a lot of people pronounce Nimrod. I know it's a mispronunciation, but I just want to throw it out there.
Nathan,
just so people know what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yes, Jeb.
Can you help here? Because I can't.
Is it often pronounced Nimrod?
Not tremendously, other than Nimrud is how I usually see it rendered in Arabic as well, and then it becomes a long oo. And Nimrod is always something we use as an insult in Kentucky when I was growing up for other kids.
Yeah. Also,
I guess I adapted Nimrod.
Chaos.
You say Nimrod? Oh, there we go.
I've only heard Bugs Bunny pronounce it Nimrod when he's talking to Elmer Fudd.
Yeah, he's Nimrod. Yeah. All right, so I just wanted to clarify. I have heard the area been described as Nimrod, especially with people who are versed with Bibles.
Is Nimrod a personage as well, I believe?
I think so.
Not
yes.
just in not just in Kentucky.
I think not just
Kentucky.
Kentucky. I think this is actual personage.
Yeah. No, but yeah, Nimrud is the site, and there are several others. Paul Myra is the one that's gotten a lot of attention, but the most iconic destruction I think has been of Nimrud. But there starts to be this real concept of these things being important to outsiders, to the West, and the concept of the West is being built at this time by this process. Like these are entangled. I mean, that's not an idea that necessarily existed that far ago. People talk about Europeans. I mean, while I work in 16th century Mesoamerica, people didn't consider themselves Europeans. That idea had not emerged. They considered themselves from this part of Spain, or at best Spanish. In fact, they actually considered themselves Christians. That's how they often referred to themselves. But that was a whole other label as well. So by the late 19th and early 20th century, you have this very strong relationship between empire and state and archaeology. I mean, the Charles Warren, he was a lieutenant in the Royal Engineers. He's often considered the first scientific biblical archaeologist. He basically secretly burrowed into the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and did the first scientific but related to the Bible text archaeology. He was in the military. He later, does all kinds of military things for the British Empire and ends up being actually the head of Scotland Yard and oversaw the infamous Trafalgar riots and then resigns after the Whitechapel murders, the Jack the Ripper murders. So, I mean, but he's the first scientific biblical archaeologist by many accountings. So these are all entangled. And I think to sort of get us into the specifics of the area of Islamic State, in the beginning of the 20th century, the intelligence network in the Middle East during World War I of the British Empire were basically archaeologists. It was most famously T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. He was an archaeologist. He used to spy on the Germans while doing archaeology right before the war, hanging out with Sir Leonard Woolley. And they all pretty much answered. There's this group called the Oxford Four, and the leader of them was Gertrude Bell. And these were all intelligence agents. They were all basically masterminding British imperial forces in the Middle East at this time. Bell then goes on and more or less has been credited as being one of the architects of the nation of Iraq, of drawing the boundaries, or helping to, and creating the concept of Iraq, as well as creating the National Museum, which of course famously was looted during the invasion in 2003. And one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating, Nathan, you've dealt a bit with one of your sort of topics of interest has been drone warfare. What's some of the arguments for why drone warfare is so important specifically in this context? Like what's used to justify it?
Well, I mean, drone warfare is among the many arguments supporting it. One of those is essentially the utilitarian argument. You can cause maximum and inflict maximum damage on the enemy with a minimum of cost, a minimum of technological cost, and obviously, with the exception of the pilots who report suffering from PTSD and other mental health issues, a minimum of human cost as well.
You don't have a pilot in a plane. It's basically a robot fighter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're able to sort of shape a battle space to your own will with a minimum of risk to your side. I mean, you're risking basically the technology of the drone, and you're risking the unpopularity of if you cause any civilian casualties as collateral or as a result of accidental targeting. But certainly at the end of the day, the drone is a way of maintaining constant surveillance and control over a territory. And I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. Well, so the first time we talked about this, you brought something to my attention because I had been sort of schooling myself up in sort of the history of archaeology and empire, but I'm still a piker when it comes to this. And you pointed out that this is not new. And a lot of the same arguments of why this has to be done by the West in the region. Can you tell us about the first real air war?
Right. Well, so as you noted, one of Britain's post World War I mandates was Iraq, fashioned as Mesopotamia, and that there was an uprising in Iraq in May 1920. It united the Sunni and the Shia and various other tribes. Well, Sunni and Shia aren't tribes, but you know what I mean. It united the Sunni and Shia communities as well as the tribal communities against the British together. And it became extraordinarily costly because the first attempt to put down this uprising cost somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000, 150,000 troops. And Great Britain could no longer afford such costs, especially coming off of the Great War. So Winston Churchill, along with other tacticians, came up with the idea of what they called aerial policing. And the goal was to be able to influence the economies and therefore the politics of Mesopotamian society through just the usage of air power. So you see a precedent for what the contemporary drone campaign is doing in varying ways in the British colonial experience in Iraq, Mesopotamia in the 1920s.
Right. And a lot of the argument for this, I mean, one, obviously, there are resources there. I mean, oil is starting to all of a sudden become really, really important. And it's also, you know, the whole area has been a strategic crossroads for a very long time. And there's other reasons. But there's increasingly, and, you know, it's is it Kipling's The White Man's Burden? Is that the poem of bringing humanitarian concerns and humanitarian support to all of these benighted regions. This is sort of this colonial ideology. And are we seeing that at this point? Are we seeing a lot of this discussion that we have to kind of be the human? You know, you use the word policing. I think that's not an accidental word.
No, it's not an accidental word. I mean, the goal is to bring conditions of peace and stability both to these societies, but also to the societies that are seeking their own protection. So when the United States is using a drone to police a territory, it's not doing so necessarily to help protect Yemenis, although ostensibly that's often presented as one of the goals. It's also to protect the American people and ensure a certain standard of life. Now, as far as I know, there's never been a drone that's been protecting Palmyra. But certainly we see the rhetoric of protecting sites alongside the rhetoric of protecting populations when we're talking about ISIS. Right.
And so this seems very familiar. We've got, you know, you mentioned ISIS saying why they and by the way, I always use Islamic State. I try not to use ISIS simply because the Egyptian god Isis is kind of awesome. Our goddess is kind of awesome. But
Jeb, did you say make ISIS great again? I think you just said make ISIS great again.
I'm pretty sure I didn't. I am a state employee of the state of Ohio. I did not say that.
I'm getting hate mail for this.
Maybe a little, but
maybe a little.
But no, I don't think so. At least not for that. But so we've got this same kind of humanitarian concerns, and there are legitimate humanitarian concerns. I mean, there's a reason millions of refugees are fleeing this region from the outside, and some of it's being tied into the archaeological. I mean, you mentioned the State Department. So we talked about Islamic State using these as a theater to antagonize the West. And I would argue that the Taliban destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan was also very much aimed at antagonizing a West that was frankly more concerned with the destruction of, say, Buddhist icons than other things. One of the other things that's been brought up with the archaeological has been looting. And I think for that, we should also look a little at the history of, specifically, we talked about the British Empire, let's talk about the Americans more recently in the region and the archaeological. In 1990 and 1991, as Desert Shield and then Desert Storm were kind of gearing up, there was at that time concern for archaeological sites. And very famously, I remember pictures of Saddam Hussein parking like MiG-23s next to the ziggurat at Ur, and concerned that, you know, Allied forces. And I remember back then some of the first smart bombs, the first, you know, laser guided munitions that most people had become aware of. That was one of the things that was mentioned, like, they can destroy these things and not damage, yes, people, but also important cultural sites and so forth. In this really perked up, though. Archaeologists stepped up and they volunteered and helped in 2003 and 2004 with the coalition invasion and occupation of Iraq. After the absolute shit show of the looting of the National Museum in Baghdad, there were a lot of efforts to stop looting. Like, archaeologists had been very familiar with, in areas of conflict, you have looters. And there was this concern that stuff was being sold, stuff was being looted, stuff was being taken from the museum, stuff was being taken from sites. And so archaeologists, they came up with, like, one of the ones I love is this playing card deck. Can you help us remember what was I want to nudge
that a bit. Yes. Mainly the basis of those cards. So of course we're all familiar with the deck of cards that had the Iraqi Ba'athist leadership.
That's what I was asking you to go to.
various figureheads were were given various values, and the soldiers in their downtime, I assume, playing cards, learned who these leaders were. And in part, I think it was one of those decks that helped lead to the recognition and arrest of so-called Chemical Ali in Iraq. The other deck, though, was developed by Lori Rush, who was an army archaeologist and anthropologist. She developed a deck of cards with notable historical material culture, other things that would be worth protecting both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So I guess they multi-purposed the deck. I think what I always found interesting about that deck, and I'm gonna try to nudge the conversation a little bit, is the top of that deck of cards says ROE first, meaning rules of engagement first. Now, typically you think of ROE, or rules of engagement, as involving individuals, specific individuals or communities, etc. Maybe economic resources, like don't bomb oil fields, or do if you're trying to degrade the enemy's economic capability. Here, ROE is being used for archaeological sites and material culture. And I think what's interesting about that is, the British were patrolling Iraq in the 20s in part to control the politics and the economics to maintain a steady supply, and arguably to maintain a steady supply of oil. There are a whole litany of reasons, as we all know, why the invasion of Iraq occurs in 2003. But to see these artifacts in essence as something requiring rules of engagement suggests there is some sort of resource protection taking place. Just as one is trying to preserve economic resources, one is also trying to preserve cultural resources. Yeah. I think that connection's interesting.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think that ties into this again. This notion of I actually have an image of a few of them here, and they very much talk about civilization in a lot of them. There's one of them. Yeah, this site, I forget what site it is. This site has survived for 17 centuries. Will it and others survive you? It's the Chesfiran Arch in Iraq. And so it goes for, 99% of humankind's history can only be understood through archaeology, ancient ruins at Sarmath in Iraq, and so forth. That there very much is that ideology, and that is laudable, because, I mean, there were reports early on of people seeing sandbags full of, like, relics. People just were like digging into archaeological context and for construction fill. And that stuff to some degree came to an end. There also was, unsurprisingly, when you have that many people moving across borders and doing all these sorts of things, there were very early on in eBay, and you can still see these cylinder seals coming out of this region, archaeological artifacts coming out of this region and going to the West. And of course, that's the real thing here. So, but let's set that up. So you mentioned State Department communiques and State Department things. What are you referring to?
Right. So around the same time, so after that June 2014 seizure of Mosul by ISIS, and with the unfolding of the campaigns in Iraq and Syria, the State Department, along with its partners in the region, various American archaeological centers, and also Syrian archaeologists, they worked together very closely to sort of articulate what they were arguing was a burgeoning looting trade that ISIS was gaining tremendous profit from. But ISIS's own narratives would seem to contradict that to a point. So I think that's going to definitely be something worth exploring after the break.
When we come back, there's a cache of records, which is interesting, some analysis, and we may have to talk about a giant plastic arch.
Hey, podcast fans, check out the ARC365 podcast at www.arcpodnet.com/ARC365. That's ARCH365 for your daily dose of archaeology. Each episode is less than 15 minutes long, and we have some great guests recording about awesome archaeology. We also try to throw in some definitions and basic archaeological information. So, check out the 365 Days of Archaeology podcast only in 2017 at www.arcpodnet.com/ARC365 today. Find us also on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and Google Music by typing ARC365 into the search. Now back to the show.
We all belong outside. We're drawn to nature, whether it's the recorded sounds of the ocean we doze off to, or the succulents that adorn our homes. Nature makes all of our lives, well, better. Despite all this, we often go about our busy lives removed from it. But the outdoors is closer than we realize. With AllTrails, you can discover trails nearby and explore confidently with offline maps and on-trail navigation. Download the free app today and make the most of your summer with AllTrails.
Are you ready to launch your career to new heights? Visit careers.dish.com/technician now and uncover a world of exciting opportunities waiting just for you. From cutting-edge technology to a supportive work environment, Dish has everything you need to thrive. Don't wait any longer to kickstart your next opportunity. Apply today and join the Dish family where innovation meets opportunity. Visit us online at careers.dish.com/technician. Your future starts now.
And we are back, and Jeb, you've got a plastic arch you want to sell me?
I will let other people sell you the plastic arch. We'll come to the plastic arch, or as a friend of mine puts it, Archie McArchface. But yeah, we'll come back to that. But so what you were telling us is that according to the State Department, once Islamic State emerged, there was a massive new network of looting, a new threat to the archaeological heritage that was unprecedented. What part of what I'm saying is not entirely accurate?
Well, so what we have to understand is the ISIS has focused very much upon having an extraction-based economy, whether that be oil or heavy taxation or outright theft from certain people, certain communities, especially non-Muslim minority communities in territories under their control. ISIS has always had an extraction economy. And in this case, I think we have to realize that for ISIS, antiquities are also a resource. So ISIS has a really well, at least on paper, a very broadly well sketched out bureaucracy, including departments of energy, electricity, street cleaning, garbage removal, public service, morality police, the Hezbollah, relations with the various tribes. But they also have what's called in Arabic the Diwan al-Rikaz, or if you want to really roughly translate it in a slightly humorous way, the department of very valuable things that come out of the ground. And so for them, Diwan al-Rikaz will control oil, it will control metals, it will also control antiquities. And we know, thanks to the reporting of a journalist named Ayman al-Tamimi, who's from Mosul, that there were fatwas that that ISIS issued that instructed its fighters and commanders to not engage in looting antiquities. Now, this runs directly counter to what the State Department and the FBI and other federal agencies, as well as their European counterparts, have reported, which was a burgeoning antiquities trade. And in part, that conversation was based upon documents that were seized in a raid that said that, that claimed that Abu Sayyaf, who at the time was a high-ranking ISIS officer, who's also believed to have kept, quite tragically, of course, Caleb Mueller as a slave, the American citizen. He was once in charge of their oil smuggling operations, and the documents seized suggested that they were receiving, maybe upwards to several $100,000, if not millions of dollars worth of revenue from antiquities looting. What strikes me as more likely is that ISIS wasn't necessarily engaged. Their foot soldiers weren't engaged in the direct looting and selling, but instead ISIS turned a very, very blind eye to the looting as long as they received their cut of the trafficking proceeds. So it was a form of extraction for them.
Just let me ask you, Ken and Sarah. You said I have the article here from the New York Times, 2016. The total sum shown from these tax receipts. This is the cash you're talking about, right? Of documents.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Was $265,000. Now, to me, and I get paid, all right, but that's a fair amount of money.
$1,000?
Okay, yeah. Exactly. Not million, 1,000. Right. Now, how does that stack up with other looting around the world?
Well, obviously that's tiny. That there are examples of individual artifacts that have have been looted and have been purchased by museums for individual artifacts that have been worth more than that amount. But the question that I want to raise, though, here is how does ISIS distinguish? How does the Islamic State distinguish between those items that must be destroyed and those items that somebody can dig those up and sell them as long as we get our cut?
Yeah.
I think that goes to, I think there's a few ways of going about that. Now, I'm speaking hypothetically here, not off direct evidence, because I haven't seen, direct legal literature from them that suggests the methodology for this. I think when we're talking about major monumental architecture involving a deity, particularly, remember, as we noted, when they first moved in to these new territories, they started killing off, or not killing off, but destroying the material culture related to gods that were specifically mentioned in the Quran or fit within that Quranic narrative of destroying the old gods to preserve the oneness of the one true God.
Sure.
So I think those artifacts merit destruction. If we're talking about a small piece, we're talking about a ring. Well, I'll get to the rings in a second. We're talking about a small clay shard, or we're talking about some sort of small animal figure, etc. Those are items that right, exactly, a cylinder seal. Those are items that they're not necessarily going to see as violating shirk, and they will allow someone to profit on that, again, as long as they receive their cut. If we're talking about a ring, or we're talking about an ancient coin that the metal of which can be determined, that's quite easy for them within their understanding of Islamic law, because there are weights and measures. The dinar and the dirham. I mean, ISIS issued publications saying they were going to return to the gold standard, so they're quite fine with measurements of gold, silver, bronze, etc. as artifacts of exchange. In fact, those may be the easiest things for them to sell off.
And
if it's deity, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would guess also that if this is so much about performance, it's much more dramatic to destroy some monumental statue of some deity. That's dramatic. That furthers their narrative. But if all you're doing is smashing cylinder seals, you're not going to get that same reaction.
Right.
And monuments don't fit in a suitcase.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Now, another thing that I was really interested in when I was reading the PowerPoint that Jeb sent around was this notion also that where's the end point? Where do these materials end up? And that pre-Islamic stuff ends up in the West. So there's a market here for those looted antiquities, but Islamic antiquities end up in the Gulf states.
That's right.
How does that happen?
Well, in part you wonder if it's okay. So if again, hypothetical or sort of hypothetically, a little bit of data, a little bit of hypothetical, the demand, I would think the demand would be highest for the Islamic art and material culture, regardless of its origin, licit or illicit, in those Gulf states where you have wealthy buyers looking to purchase that sort of symbolic capital. The same in the West with this sort of Western Mesopotamian sort of narrative of civilization. And in fact,
cradle of civilization.
We do know a lot of the trafficking routes follow the paths of refugees. And I've always wondered if, these looters were selling goods to those fleeing Syria and fleeing these conflict zones. They sold them these artifacts saying, this will be worth something. It may not be worth direct money, but if you trade this with the correct Westerner, it will open a door for you as you move into Europe.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, like this cylinder seal got our family out of there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's understandable. I mean, we've talked about looting before on this podcast, on other podcasts, and it's easy to make it sound like it's a cut and dry issue, looting bad, done. And I think when we're dealing with like looting here in America, where we're dealing with pot hunters and people who are just going out to dig up things because they want a pretty bottle in their kitchen, I mean, that's pretty cut and dry. But when we're dealing with things like what Nathan just mentioned, what Jeb and Nathan just mentioned, the whole like this cylinder seal got my family out of this situation, I mean, it creates a really weird problem, I feel like.
Well, and it gets to, I think, the real core issue here. Ken, you mentioned, the Islamic stuff goes to capital in the Gulf states. The non-Islamic stuff goes to capital in London.
Right.
And in Germany, and in Las Vegas, and in New York, and in Tokyo, and in Moscow, and everywhere else, where this stuff is seen as, and civilization. But let's talk about that. So the last thing, I think this is actually in many ways one of the most interesting parts, at least to my interests, is, so therefore that's why they're important, is how archaeologists react. Because archaeologists are like, look, a lot of archaeologists are clearly you need to support the local archaeologists on the scene. I have found numerous articles who are like, look, yes, we're doing what we can, but oh my God, look at these people who are risking their lives to save these, who are professionals, who are Muslims, who are Syrians, who are, all these kinds of things.
Right.
But then you have people, some of whom are in politics, and some of whom are in business, who I think sense opportunities and they see the symbolic value. So right off the bat, I mean, we keep talking about, who's the market? Well, the market is galleries and museums and collectors. And there have been collectors associations and spokespeople. And I don't know if there have been museum spokespeople, but I know there have been for collectors who have said, well, because looting has gotten so much worse with Islamic State. Of course, there was massive amounts of looting before this. I mean, just absolutely massive in that region and elsewhere. This is a drop in the bucket. And as Nathan pointed out,
one of the most famous photos that makes the surface of Syria like the surface of the moon was actually taken in territory that, as I understood it, in 2012 wasn't under ISIS control. But it's often cited as satellite imagery showing ISIS looting, right? So,
of course,
absolutely, yeah.
Well, it's desert and it's brown people, Nathan. It's all the same. But
we're so sensitive here.
But and it's sarcasm, everybody, for the love of God.
Oh no, I understand.
Not just you, I mean our audience. But so they were literally arguing, wow, because things have gotten so much worse, we can't let restrictive government get in the way. We need to loosen the regulations on collecting and trafficking and importing so that we can save these things.
So they're doing God's work. They're doing God's work by producing a safe haven for these things that would otherwise be destroyed.
They are totally helping the situation in every way by providing a market. Yes, that is absolutely how logic and economics work. Is if you build a market, I'm sure nobody will meet the demand. I'm sure nobody will.
Well, and there's also this argument of, and I don't know if you guys have heard it, but I've heard it a few times, the whole, it's their history. They should be allowed to do with it as they please. And who are we to step in and say, no, you can't sell your own history if that's what you want to do?
That applies here because I don't think it's seen as their history. It gets back to that colonial idea of these people standing in front of these monuments, they're just inconvenient barbarians in between us and the cradle of civilization. And I think that idea is still really strong. Mm-hmm. And also, Islamic State is in conflict with the legitimate governments of the region with their archaeologists. So no, I don't think that applies here, but I do know what you're talking about. I think here, though, there's not going to be too many apologists for Islamic State that are going to, I think, make that argument. So the one that really drives me up a wall. Now, I'm saying what I'm about to say as someone who has a 3D printer and a 3D scanner downstairs, as someone who's kind of made their name at my employer a bit with technology, has been the technology can solve this. There have been all of these efforts by companies and interests and so forth to use tech, and some of them are interesting. Some are like using GIS, using geographical information system programs to track looting, to show hotspots. Very famously, and I would not criticize this at all, Sarah Parcak and her space archaeology, where she won the $1 million TED Prize to use public crowdsourcing, or not crowdfunding, but crowd interaction, public science, to get people to use satellite and aerial imagery to detect the evidence of looting and work with local governments. That's a really cool idea because that's getting at the larger issue. But there have been people that have been really trying to use tech to sort of ameliorate this problem. And a lot of it often ends up feeling very self-serving or serving of certain ideologies. And the one that caught a lot of attention was what archaeologist Gabe Moshansky called on Twitter from University College London, Archie McArchface. Not long before Brexit. And I say that simply because at that time, Mayor of London, Boris Johnson I think he was mayor at that time, was all over this thing. After the Palmyra Arch, this beautiful arch from Roman era from Palmyra had been destroyed by Islamic State. It got reconstructed using 3D tech, and then they printed out a scale version of it. Not a full scale, if I remember. I think it was like a partial scale, and it kind of looks like a butter sculpture. We can link to pictures of this in the show notes. It kind of looks like a butter sculpture, yes, and they put it in Trafalgar Square. Now, did I mention that this is in Trafalgar Square, which is pretty much the heart of the British Empire and named after the guy that that more or less captured the Rosetta Stone from Napoleon? I mean, this is not neutral imagery. But so much wordage around this was barbarians versus civilization. That we, Western civilization, are saving the cradle of civilization, with sometimes Western not in there, using our high-tech advanced ways. And all I can think of is, well, if we just fly enough biplanes or drones or what, I mean, it feels almost like the same argument. And also, and a lot of archaeologists looked at this thing and were like, this thing's a joke. This is being used to support bombing campaigns. It's also being used to support weird ideas about materiality. Like, again, I 3D print stuff, and looking at this thing was just odd. Ken, it sounds like from your laugh after you finally got a picture of it.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, it sort of,
right.
it sort of does
It
look
looks
like
a butter sculpture.
Butter sculpture. We'll have to put a picture of that up.
Well,
You know, it
like you
really,
see it at Ag Fair.
yeah, no, it really does.
We have an ag fair up here in Connecticut where you see they have all they sculpt a cow, and it just looks bizarre. And that the 3D image, the 3D print of the arch looks a lot like a butter sculpture.
Yeah, and I'm not.
I do a lot of 3D printing, and there's been a lot of talk in the archaeology community about 3D printing. There's artifacts, any artifact, honestly, to be used for like teaching purposes or just manhandling purposes, so you don't break the actual thing. But a lot of the problem is unless you've got the technology to make that scan decent in the first place, you're going to end up with these butter sculptures. And also it comes down to your printer. I mean, if you don't got, my English. If you don't have a fine enough nozzle and a good enough printer, it's not going to turn out that great.
I think
and
technologically,
you may as well be printing butter, I guess.
Technologically, I think they just chose a poor material. But technologically, it's fine. That's not the problem. It's what the hell is this thing?
It's the symbolism. It's the symbolism inherent in it, absolutely.
It's weird. It's this bizarre piece, and it clearly you mentioned State Department, Nathan. Is there a lot of this language? Was there a lot of this language in the sort of the State Department stuff, or was it more coming from outside political actors of like civilization and barbarism? And
I didn't see as much of the sort of civilization and barbarism narrative out of the State Department. What I sort of saw was obviously there's the concern about the economic flow, right, to ISIS.
Okay.
There is the concern about, but I will say what I was impressed with the State Department was their concern about the Syrian cultural heritage, which of course ties into the articles we were talking about of Syrians themselves, like we mentioned earlier, Dr. Assad being brutally murdered as they tried to protect these sites. So I don't necessarily they fashion themselves as the preservers of Western civilization, but I will tell you who did. When Russia retook Palmyra in May of 2016, the first thing they did was to throw up, of course, large banners of Vladimir Putin and Assad and others, and then have a classical music concert in the amphitheater, the very same amphitheater where those men had been brutally executed some months before, about 8 or 9 months before. So it was a sense of restaking a civilizational claim on that which had been corrupted, in essence, by the barbarians. And again, it goes back, I think, to this idea of culture as a resource, and I think, and putting the arch in Trafalgar, I think you're absolutely right. It's another way of locating that civilizational narrative in a very specific way. But it's almost as if, and I'm probably gonna get made fun of for this one, but I mean, the arch itself is a low risk drone, right? You don't risk anything printing out that arch. And having it in
That's true.
Right? It's a sort of low risk way of showing yourself as a defender of civilization.
Yeah, it's just a show.
Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely a good way. And again, a lot of archaeologists criticize it. And by the way, I actually State Department loves diplomacy. I mean, they've done other things. USAID does good things, but it's also been other things. I have a number of good friends in state, actually, some of whom are archaeologists. Yeah, and so I don't want to make that as a criticism. It's more just that I think there were larger political forces that, and some of them were much more, again, outside of government, with some of these quotes. But yeah, the orchestra that's amazing. And it just, this all becomes, we talk about performance, and all of this becomes very much performance, and yet, like you said, there are people who understand this stuff on the ground. One of the articles we mentioned, Ordinary Syrians Are Risking Their Lives to Protect Their Cultural Heritage, by Emma Cunliffe on The Wire, is talking, and I see the same arguments in Latin America. You know, you see all these big shows about like looting, but the people that deal with it are like Peruvian archaeologists and Guatemalan archaeologists on the ground dealing with people that are also in the drug trafficking and the human trafficking and exotic animals trafficking businesses. So, yeah, it's a lot of people performing kind of at times fantastical narratives. I think that's why this kind of fits here, in addition to other reasons. And then we've seen this before. People take archaeology, they take heritage, they know it has value, and they use it for their own political ends. This is not exactly a new story in that regard.
Right.
No, and it's I don't think it's a story that we're going to be able to solve anytime soon, because a lot of history is pageantry, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things we've also talked about. We're not just in the debunking or the whatever. We're in the, this is also inherently interesting cultural. So, well, Nathan? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so to close from my last sort of thought, what I would always remind my students, and I would sort of remind the audience, is this sort of idea of civilization and state building is occurring all the time. And even though it may look initially as extraordinarily barbaric, ISIS is involved in the same type of project. They use more violence, or they're more explicit in their violence to express that sort of state building.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are times in the history of pretty much any empire, if there happened to be YouTube, it would look pretty awful, to say the least.
YouTube is pretty awful if you know where to go, and I'm not encouraging people to go hunt that down, but it's out there.
Nathan, thank you so much for surviving our audio problems. This has definitely been one of our somewhat more audio challenged episodes.
It's just fuzzy.
It's a little fuzzy, to say the least.
Well, hopefully everyone makes it to the end. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It was great meeting you, Nathan. This was a wonderful podcast.
Yeah,
great job.
And I want to thank you all for showing up. Any other last thoughts?
No, this has been a really deep conversation. I hope our listeners really appreciated it. I know it's not our normal thing, but I think this is a very important topic, and I think it very much is in line with the show. Yeah, it's very much in line with the show. So I hope people get some value out of this. And Nathan, thank you so much for bringing all of your knowledge to the show with us.
Of course, thanks for the invitation. Anytime.
As one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher, and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's. Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals. That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Chicken taco expert since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.